At dawn, the Colosseum stirred to life. The first rays of sunlight bathed its ancient arches, casting long shadows across the arena floor, where the blood of previous spectacles still clung to the sand. Beneath the stands, vendors called out, eager to make their sales, baskets filled with olives and watered down wine ready for a crowd that hadn't even settled into their seats. The gates rattled as handlers shoved half-starved beasts into position, lions with their ribs showing, elephants stomping in protest, and panthers clawing at the bars of their cages. From the darkened tunnels, the sounds of swords being tested echoed through the arena, not in preparation for a simple training session, but for a blood-soaked spectacle. Above it all, a murmur of excitement began to swell. Tens of thousands of Romans filled the seats, eager for the one thing their empire had perfected: death, packaged as entertainment. The Roman arena wasn't merely a place for sport. It was a gruesome theater, a stage where emperors demonstrated their power, often at the expense of human life. Here, the line between entertainment and cruelty blurred, and blood was spilled in the name of politics, propaganda, and control. This was a place where life and death were not only determined by the sword but also by the will of those in charge. Today, we dive into some of the most brutal and merciless arena acts that pushed the boundaries of cruelty even for Rome, acts that went too far and marked the darkest corners of Roman entertainment. The first gladiatorial combat in Rome, however, didn't begin in a grand amphitheater with roaring crowds. It began at a funeral. In 264 BC, the sons of Decimus Junius Brutus Sceva decided that the best way to honor their father wasn't with prayers, poetry, or statues, but with blood. They arranged for 3 pairs of armed slaves to fight to the death in the Forum Boarium, a cattle market that smelled of dung and smoke. This wasn't an act of entertainment. It was a solemn obligation known as munus, a duty owed to the deceased. The roots of this ritual date back long before the rise of Rome itself. In the ancient Italian region of Campania, warriors were sacrificed at graves to appease the spirits of the dead. Over time, these sacrifices evolved into combat, where men were forced to fight in honor of the deceased. It was no longer random victims, but men chosen for their strength and valor. The Samnites, a once bitter enemy of Rome, practiced these contests regularly, and the Roman elite, ever eager to cement their power and influence, eagerly adopted the custom. The idea wasn't just to honor the dead, but to demonstrate how powerful the family was, symbolized by a violent spectacle that would leave the whole city talking. By the 3rd century BC, Roman leaders realized these combats could serve more than just a religious or familial purpose. They could be a tool for political power. Religious festivals, which were traditionally sacred, began to feature gladiatorial games, often sponsored by magistrates seeking popularity and loyalty from the public. What began as a festival to honor Jupiter, the king of the gods, gradually transformed into ludi romani, public games featuring brutal combat. The Senate framed this as an act of piety, but to the citizens, it was clear that these games were political tools designed to keep the masses entertained and loyal to the state. The gladiators themselves became symbols, dressed to resemble Rome's defeated enemies: the Samnite gladiator with his heavy shield and helmet, the Thrax wielding his curved blade, and the Gaul with his long sword. Each one represented a conquered foe. Watching them fight wasn't just about bloodshed, it was about reliving Roman victories and reinforcing the empire's dominance. The violence on the sand became a constant reminder of Rome's military might and the subjugation of others. The Colosseum wasn't just a venue for sport, it was a tool of propaganda. As the years passed, the venues for these bloody displays grew larger and more permanent. At first, temporary wooden stands were constructed for special occasions. But by the late Republic, these makeshift arenas were replaced by grand stone amphitheaters, permanent monuments to violence where thousands could gather. These games no longer belonged to families or private individuals, they belonged to the state. Each drop of blood spilled in the arena was another reminder that Rome controlled not just its armies, but the very concept of life and death itself. By this time, what had started as ritual sacrifice had become a form of mass entertainment. Emperors realized that the arena wasn't just a place for violent contests, it was a way to control the people. Death, in the Colosseum, wasn't just a tragic end, It was a performance, and the spectators were as much a part of the show as the gladiators or the beasts. The gladiators weren't just fighters, they were pawns in a larger political game, meant to entertain, but also to demonstrate the power of Rome over life and death. The crowd wasn't always cheering for the gladiators. Sometimes the roar was for the animals, beasts dragged from the farthest corners of the known world. Lions from North Africa, leopards from the Caucasus, crocodiles from the Nile, even giraffes from far-off lands were paraded into the arena. These animals weren't seen as marvels of nature but as victims, caught, starved, and unleashed for the amusement of the crowd. Romans called these spectacles venations, or hunts, but they were not about survival. They were about domination. The animals were forced to fight each other, or were pitted against armed hunters, who were often called bestiarii. It wasn't enough to capture these beasts from distant lands. Rome needed to display its power by destroying them for sport. Julius Caesar set the stage for these kinds of spectacles early on. In 46 BC, he unveiled a giraffe, a creature never before seen in Europe. The Romans had no idea what to call it, so they named it camelopardalis, half camel, half leopard. The poor animal didn't survive long. It was thrown into the arena to be torn apart by the crowd, not admired for its rarity. For Caesar, this was a clear statement: if Rome could conquer the strangest and most exotic creatures on earth, it could conquer anything. The scale of these animal spectacles was staggering. At the inauguration of the Colosseum in AD 80, Emperor Titus reportedly killed over 9,000 animals in a single event. Some were forced to fight one another, others were pitted against armed hunters. Archaeologists have even found bones of animals that showed signs of starvation, proving that these beasts were intentionally weakened before being released, making the fights an unfair bloodbath. Even elephants, once feared by the Roman legions during the time of Hannibal, were dragged into the sand and slaughtered for the amusement of the crowd. The logistics of these spectacles were massive. Animals had to be captured from distant lands, transported, and kept alive long enough to appear in the arena. It wasn't just a spectacle. It was an empire-wide operation, with caravans traveling across deserts and fleets of ships transporting creatures from Africa and Asia. Each animal was a symbol of Rome's far-reaching power and a reminder of the empire's ability to capture and destroy whatever it chose. Some emperors turned these hunts into personal vanity projects. Commodus, the infamous emperor, was never shy about seeking attention. He strutted into the arena dressed as Hercules, slaughtering hundreds of animals himself. These hunts, where animals were often tethered or injured to ensure Commodus's victory, were staged, but the crowd still cheered, out of fear, not admiration. In the Roman Empire, when the emperor entered the arena, the crowd was expected to cheer. But behind the applause, there was a darker side. Ancient writers like Pliny the Elder recorded how the repeated hunts and killings led to the extinction of some species. Entire populations of animals were driven to extinction just to satisfy the Roman lust for blood. The Colosseum wasn't just a theater of death, it was also an engine of environmental destruction. Yet to the Romans, extinction didn't matter. What mattered was the illusion of control. The arena became a place where nature itself could be tamed, captured, and ultimately destroyed for entertainment. The word gladiator often conjures images of evenly matched fighters, skilled men dueling in combat with honor in front of roaring crowds. But the truth is far more disturbing. The Romans didn't just stage fair fights, they engineered mismatches and invented bizarre weapons to push the spectacle into darker realms. Some gladiators weren't even given a chance to survive. Prisoners, criminals, and captives were often dressed in ridiculous costumes, armed with wooden swords, and sent into the arena to face skilled fighters. These weren't matches. They were public executions, disguised as sport. The weapons used in the arena were as symbolic as the gladiators themselves. The retiarius, for example, fought with a net and a trident, his opponent carrying a short sword and a helmet designed to protect him from the net. The match wasn't about skill, it was about suspense. Would the net entangle the opponent, or would the sword cut through? The crowd loved the drama, even if it was rigged from the start. Romans didn't stop there. They experimented with the number of combatants, staging massive battles where hundreds of men fought at once, turning the arena floor into a bloody swamp of bodies and broken weapons. The more chaos, the more thrilling it was for the crowd. There were also female gladiators, gladiatresses, who fought in the 1st century AD. Though initially seen as novelties, they fought with real weapons and participated in battles that were just as brutal as those fought by men. The Romans blurred the lines of gender, proving that anyone could be part of the empire's insatiable appetite for violence and spectacle. But the most disturbing spectacles were the staged executions. The condemned were often forced to play out tragic myths for the amusement of the audience. Thieves were torn apart by wild animals, arsonists were burned alive, and traitors were mauled by lions. These executions were not random acts of justice, they were carefully staged morality plays. The victims' deaths were designed to remind the crowd of the empire's power, and to show what happened to those who defied Rome. In these brutal spectacles, the line between myth and reality became blurred. Prisoners were forced to act out scenes from Roman mythology, often ending in real, horrifying deaths. Orpheus, the musician who charmed animals with his music, was portrayed in the arena. But instead of soothing the beasts, he was torn apart by a bear. Hercules, who in myth overcame impossible challenges, met his demise in the arena. His death staged for the crowd's entertainment. The Colosseum was not just a theater for physical death. It was a stage for the destruction of meaning, where even Rome's most cherished myths could be twisted into spectacles of suffering. What was once sacred, like the stories of gods and heroes, became fodder for the emperor's vanity. Through these performances, the state reinforced its power over the people, proving that nothing, no matter how sacred, was beyond its control. By the end of the Roman Empire, as it crumbled under the weight of its own decadence, the Colosseum still stood, its arches weathered, its sands stained with the memories of the past. But the echoes of the violence that occurred within its walls never truly faded. What had once been a symbol of Rome's might and control became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how far a civilization can go when it turns cruelty into entertainment. The Colosseum, a structure meant to embody Rome's strength, now serves as a monument to its moral decay.